1998 process. That constitution, the 1998 constitution, was written inside a military compound. So anybody could access, anybody had access to it, except for the representatives. In 2008, there were some strong messages sent just from the beginning. And it was called in an open building. Everybody could access. It was the building was located in a small coast town. It was not the political center of the country, Quito. And there were several aspects who would give this message, saying, you know, this constitution is not going to be like the others, and there's like more participation, it's more open to the public. And little by little, we will talk about this later, that all the conditions were changing, and people were seeing that even though people had the hope that the Constituent Assembly will solve its problems immediately, that was not the case, but little by little implementation was key in order to demonstrate that those constitutional changes implemented were becoming a reality in the future. That's it.
Thank you, Carl. I would like to hear from you later in the session about what you said about people's concern about this constitution not to repeat mistakes of earlier ones, of people's ownership of the process. It resonates very well with the sentiment in the Arab world right now, so we will want to hear more about that. But just to continue to understand a little bit about the context before we proceed in the discussion, I'll turn to Dr. Ogert, and I will ask, this is probably on this panel, the newest of those constitutions. The experience in Kenya, a country very close to the hearts of Egyptians, is always associated with two big words: corruption and inequalities based on tribal or ethnic difficulties and challenges. Why was it important to write a constitution in 2010, and what were the issues on the minds of people writing the constitution at that time?
Okay, I think if you allow me, I just want to summarize my comments in maybe 2 minutes, and I want to show you a clip, a small video, about the context in which we wrote the Kenyan Constitution. And therefore, if you are the faint-hearted, I will ask you to be there. Because what you're about to see gave us a reality check as a country. Why we must have a constitution, if you allow me. Again, you know, the faint-hearted, just to exit. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to traumatize you, but that was my country in 2007, 2008. And Kenya was slowly joining the countries that were nearly collapsing or was very failing states. And therefore what we did as a country, just to give you the context, was to take a reality check on ourselves. Because there's a lot of pretense in Kenya, was a lot of pretense for a long time, and I'm sure it is in many other African countries and maybe the developing world, that we really want to reform. We want to change. We talk the language of economic, social, cultural rights. We perfect that talk, but actually we don't believe in it. So what we did as a country is to just take stock of who we are. This is my country then. It was collapsing. So the reason, the context really, under which we wrote our constitution is because we talked about it for a long time. We had a failed attempt in 2005 after 20 years of constitution making. There are those who say it goes back to the time of the colony because the governance structure we inherited at independence was not one of our own. So we wanted to make a constitution, an order in which all of us can relate to. So the post-election balance give us a reason to reconstruct our country. I believe the revolution might have also given you a reason to reconstruct Egypt. Yesterday when I came, I spoke to a friend called Ashraf, and this is what Ashraf told me, that during the revolution, Egyptians knew what they didn't want. After the revolution, Egyptians want what they don't know. I don't know how true that is, but the other context for us was a failed leadership, which is why you find in our constitution an entire chapter called leadership and integrity. We are even defining what kind of character and leader in Kenya we want, because it's that leadership that has failed to ensure that eco-social rights are realized by every Kenyan. And therefore, we had a deeply divided society by the time we had the constitution. And if we had more time, I'll have told you about the contentious issues in the Kenyan constitution-making process, which really were about three main ones. System of governance, in which the political power concentrated in one part of the country, and so was development and opportunities that come with it. Then you had devolution, the idea that the national cake was not equally shared. So we needed to decentralize. And then, of course, how do you bring this new order into effect? Like yesterday. In a nutshell, that's the context under which we wrote our constitution.
Wow. Thank you for that. We come back to this question because it is, I would say, the crux of the whole issue. To discuss justice, it means you need that reality check, as you said, and you need to be structured. You said the country, and I would say also be structured capture the balance of power in your country, which you answered by revolution, you answered by leadership, you answered by politics. I will ask you to try to, when we proceed in this session, come back to this issue of the balance of power that creates injustices and how we all experience it. Last but not least, another country that is very close and dear to the minds last but not least to South Africa, and I will ask Jackie to comment on the context in which the South African Constitution was written, and to remind people that there was an interim constitution and then and tell us about the major challenges in that context, because we only know about the road picture, which is very enlightening. We wanted to move forward and save this country from bloodshed. So I was asking, oh, that's a different one. I was asking Jackie to remind us of the context in which the South African interim and then permanent constitution was written, because in our minds, South Africa is a rosy picture of a great, great leadership that saved its country a lot of bloodshed. But we want to know from Jackie the reality check.
Hello, thank you very much. I think it's worth remembering that South Africa between 1948 and 1994 had a system of racial domination that was legally entrenched by the courts and by legislation, in terms of which South Africa was categorized into 4 main racial groups: whites, coloreds, Indians and Africans, with whites being the minority in terms of the population size, but being the dominant ruling class, and ensuring by all means law, legislation, power, military, police, etc., that they remained dominant. And the system of racial oppression in South Africa extended beyond simply the political. It extended to every sphere of life, via laws and the courts that upheld those laws. So that meant every single part of one's life was regulated racially: where you lived, what kind of jobs you could do, what toilet you sat on, what hospital you went to, who you could marry, every single aspect of life. So it was obviously absolutely essential that when change eventually came, that it's not only focus on political freedom, but also focus on socioeconomic freedom and on full participation in democracy. So there were debates around this at the time when the Constitution was being drafted. Some people felt socioeconomic rights were just very fluffy and vague and non-justiciable, but there was a strong feeling that the whole of South Africa needed to participate in democracy, and that socioeconomic rights were a key tool to this end. And in terms of how we ended up in that position to have a negotiated settlement and constitution drafting, my view is it very much conforms to classic theory on transitions from authoritarian regimes. We got to a point where the apartheid regime could note there was a stalemate between the apartheid regime and the liberation forces led by the African National Congress, but the other liberation forces aligned to it as well, whereby the African National Congress, the liberation forces, couldn't overthrow the state, but the state couldn't fully wipe them out. On top of that was an economic aspect, that economic sanctions were really harming the South African government. So, according to my argument, the more enlightened people in the apartheid regime began to see that in order to keep hold of economic power, they had to surrender political power. And so that's what started the negotiated settlement, the negotiations. It was a very consultative process. People far and wide were consulted. There was an official drafting process, but it fed into it like somebody was talking about earlier today, the genuine feelings and the sentiments of people around the country. There was a long and exhaustive process to find out what people wanted and what was important to them. That fed into first the interim constitution of 1993 and then the final constitution, which we sit with today, of 1996, which we refer to as the constitution. I would say that there were four main compromises, which I'll just talk about quickly, and maybe later I'll talk about the consequences. The one was we did not entrench a right to work. The second is we did entrench a property clause, very controversially, meaning that the people who had property, i.e. white people, had there was a lot of protection and some limits on redistribution. Also, we did not entrench socioeconomic rights in the sense of having, very clearly speaking, an immediate minimum core. They are all, with the exception of education, subject to the caveats of progressive realization according to available resources. And then also, like has been mentioned, we, as a political compromise, settled on quite a decentralized, devolved form of power. And there have been, these compromises have of course had consequences, which perhaps we'll speak about later. Thank you.
Great. I think it's important that Jackie chose to use the word compromise and highlight the major compromises made in that constitution, which reminds me of something that I want to take as the second round, the theme that we focus on in that second round, and we'll ask Dr. Jardim to start us off from Brazil. Jackie, your word compromise reminds me again of the structure of power in which constitutions have to make space for social justice. Brazil is now considered in the Arab world a model for having achieved some successful policies on social justice, such as Brazil is considered in the Arab world as a country with models on having achieved some successful policies on social justice. Trying to address for us that issue and simplify the matter for us. How much did the Constitution of Brazil, since this is the theme of the conference, how much did the Constitution of Brazil create the space for the defense of socioeconomic rights? What were the main achievements of the Brazilian Constitution in this regard? And has Brazil had to do any compromise with existing power structures on its way to fulfilling social justice policy?
The first challenge is to ask a lawyer to speak in a simplified manner. I have to know this lawyer. Let me explain you something. The original format was different. We were supposed to make short 15-minute presentations on each of our countries' experience, and then we changed to this format. So I'm not sure I will be making much sense, because I had prepared myself for another format in order to establish the cases, make points to have a conclusion of how things are and why they became so in Brazil. So in order for you for myself to try to make myself understood, let me begin now by making the concluding remark of what was to be my presentation, so that you can understand better what's behind my own remarks. And the concluding remark was that economic social rights in Brazil are not protected nor guaranteed in light of ethical values, nor based on egalitarian philosophy. but primarily for electoral manipulation. Ever since the mid-40s, socioeconomic and cultural rights have been a tool for gaining votes. With one exception, the Cardozo administration, the strict fiscal policies, the strict budgetary constraints, and the consequence was that his party has lost 3 presidential elections and is going to lose next year again. So, you've just mentioned that in Arab countries, Brazil is viewed as a success in social policy. You should know what's bad. It has been electoral manipulation. For instance, 25% of our population is given food stamps and school bonuses. That's 52 million people. They live off school bonuses and food stamps. There are subsidies for home appliances, laptops, and iPads. But who's going to reduce subsidies? There are elections next year. So whatever is negotiated is either directly or Apple people love Brazil.
Dr. Oxford, would you like to comment on this, which is now developing as a theme for this session? The idea that, number one, Jackie says it's all about establishing compromises to make sure you achieve some of the rights, but taking the context into consideration, the South African regime had to give up political power and maybe some economic rights to the people, but kept a lot of economic power, as you said, and some of this economic power was partly present in the Constitution by restricting socio-economic rights to some extent. Dr. Khalidin reminded us of the issue of how you finance social and economic rights, keeping electoral victory in mind all the time. The Kenyan context, as harsh as you showed it to us, with all of its socio-economic injustices, resulted in one of the most progressive constitutions, at least that's how it comes out. What are the compromises that this constitution had to face and deal with?
I think, in a nutshell, one would say that similar to probably South Africa, the power for the first time left the center in Kenya, in the context of devolution. So we say that if you are a national state organ and you want to enjoy that lifetime, then you must demonstrate to us as Kenyans the extent to which you develop every part of the Republic of Kenya. Because let's consider, for example, the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Water and Agriculture. So you will have to tell us as a country, how are you devolving that service to every part of the country? That for us was a huge compromise, devolution itself. Not just of the service, but also of the power. So that now at the county level, we created 47 counties. If you like, governments, call it county governments. And we say that every county government is independent from the national government, but they work together. So that was another compromise in terms of political power, being given to the governments of the 47 counties, so that they are able to participate in the political economy of their counties to serve the people. I would say another compromise is found in our chapter 12 of the Constitution, which is about public finance. For the first time in Kenya, we say we must create what is called an equalization fund. For example, the county city of Nairobi, which for the longest time has enjoyed a lot of infrastructure, development, schools, roads, hospitals, should be able to be brought closer to the county, say, of Turkana, where I come from. That's in the northern part of Kenya. After 20 years, and we put in a sunset clause of 20 years. But after 20 years, we sit down and say, how does the county of Turkana, which is up in the north, very remote, no school, no medical, all these economic structures, how does it compare with the county of America? So we started doing those balances. And I think I would say that is the extent to which we began the compromise. But the other compromise I would say is the idea of inclusion of everyone. Recognizing everyone, that everyone in the country matters. So that you begin to identify vulnerable members of society. So in our constitution, we have defined who a marginalized community is, who a minority group is, what affirmative action is, and what you need to do as a state organ or the national government to show the extent to which steps are you taking to bring equity or equality. Maybe last week I said that we have now put a measure in our constitution to say that it's not enough as a country or as a national government to say we do not have the resources to provide ECOSOC rights. Demonstrate to us that you do not have it. So it's no longer the idea of progressive realization. There is an element that you must prove. Show us that you don't have the capacity, or what policies are being put in place, or what are your failings. So if you don't do that, anyone, not just the ones who are affected, anyone can go to court and compel the government to ensure that. So it's up to the government to come and say, I am not able to do it because of A, B, C, D reason. But you can no longer hide behind the fact that we do not have resources, we will progressively realize these rights, and we took the bold step in ensuring that all the treaties that we have signed as a country, rules of international law, are part and parcel of our constitution.
You have mentioned 2 points of extreme importance that I'd like to highlight. The last point, that all international treaties signed by the government are part of national law and part of this constitution. There is no specificity issue for Kenya about it. There is no dancing around the issue.
No, I think it's if you look at Article 2, Clause 5 or Clause 6 of the Kenyan Constitution, we actually say that all rules of international law are part and parcel of the Kenyan law. And the reason we say that is, look, the International Convention on Economic and Cultural Rights was ratified in 1966. Kenya accepted it in 1972. But ever since, it's been a song. We talk about progressive realization. So this time around, we said, you know what, enough is enough. We're not going to talk about this theoretically because it affects people's existence, it affects people's dignity. So now we say, let it be part of our life. Now you show us why you're not able to give people health facilities, education, food, so that in Article 43 of the Kenyan Constitution, we say everybody has the right to food. Let the state come and say they're not able to give you food, and tell us what steps you are taking to ensure people realize that food. I know he's telling me that one day he'll regret it, but I think it's the right step, a step in the right direction.
Dr. Taqeem, I will give you the chance to explain why you said one day you will regret it if you want to do so. But I would want to continue and dwell for very few minutes on this issue of trying to manage those different interests in society that Jackie called introducing some compromises in the Constitution to allow managing different interests in society. I dwell on it only for 2 minutes to give Carlo the chance to talk about this if he wants, and then I'll move on because I don't want this to be a session of compromises. And I move on to ask another question about how the societies in our countries claim the rights beyond the compromises, even if they exist in the Constitution. Carlo, any issues you want to do on that compromise theme?
Yeah, well, it's always a constitutional process. It's always a negotiation, a permanent negotiation, and there were many interests in play. But one of the things that all the political capital that the actual president had at the time reflected on how many seats he got in the Constituent Assembly. So anyway, it was a matter just of votes in the first case. But there was also a very important share of public participation. There were public audiences, all the constituent members went to the territories and listened to the people. There were citizens who also provide ideas or inputs if they wanted through social participation community that was created in the Constituent Assembly. But also, everything and all the information was always public. It was always, all the drafts were available to the public online. The sessions were transmitted, broadcasted live. And there was a lot of public scrutiny on what was the Constituent Assembly done. So as soon as there were some news about what this commission was thinking about any kind of right, the public debate started immediately. And if they were not very happy with the idea of the result, they would start exerting pressure. And also the thing that there was also this process where they could portray people who were rejecting change or institutional change or change in the structure of the state. They were saying that they were portrayed also as people against these good change that they were looking for. So at some point, all the political gains and interests that were in the middle of this constituent debate were in the long run solved with public appearances and broadcasting and transparency. So that was a little bit that limited this struggle of powers within the Constituent Assembly as well.
Jackie, you've written extensively on the issue of socioeconomic rights being symbols of substance, and you've also written extensively on the role of the judiciary, and you're part of South African dialogue and debate about the role of the judiciary in claiming the rights. And that will be now the last round of questions for you all. We understand that politics is the art of the possible. It's not just normative. And we understand, as you said, that there are compromises that were made, at least in your case. But we also understand from your countries and from others that society has to continue to pressure and demand and push the frontier for the fulfillment of social and economic rights and the entire social justice mission. Tell us a little bit more about your experience in South Africa with the various stakeholders that you think have continued in your country to push for social justice, even within a constitution that has those compromises.
I think I'd like to start with disagreeing with my colleague from Brazil. I think it is absolutely essential that socioeconomic rights are entrenched, that they're clearly justiciable, and indeed that they have this immediate component that the state would have to justify failure to fulfill, as the Kenyan government and constitution has done. And I think this is particularly important in countries, in fact, like Brazil and South Africa, which are the most unequal countries in the world. So it's not a question in these countries of resources per se. It's a question of distribution of the resources. And I think it is essential. And I really do think that this is something that we all need to understand, that the only security is equality, that you can build your fence higher and higher and higher, and you can send your children to private schools and you can have private security, but you're never going to have proper security until there is equality and until people all have a decent standard of living. And for that reason, I think it is important that socioeconomic rights are taken seriously, that one starts with a basic level and progressively realizes beyond that and works towards greater equality. I think it's very clear that the countries that are the least violent, that have the least domestic violence or gender-based violence, are the most equal. And how do I think socioeconomic rights can do this? They don't just jump off the page and fulfill equality on their own. But what they do, very importantly, and I think South Africa has shown this, they provide tools. They provide tools that disempowered groups can use to mobilize around, to organize around, even just simply to conscientize themselves, to become full human beings, to realize that the things that they see other people doing are not just hopes, but they are rights. And to make people really be able to benefit from and fully participate in democracy, hold government accountable, hold their heads up, be heard, and ultimately to be able to realize, not necessarily all tomorrow, and that's certainly not been the example in South Africa, but the fact that we have socioeconomic rights entrenched in the Constitution has clearly empowered social groupings in South Africa, otherwise marginalized groupings, shack dwellers. For example, if you're going to be here tomorrow, you might see a short clip on the shack dwellers movement in South Africa, and how they've used rights. And it's not just litigation, it's about, as I said, empowerment, organizing, mobilizing, and sometimes just even having to threaten the government and say, we will go to the courts, and then they achieve results. So I think that South Africa has been a very clear example that socioeconomic rights, or rights in general, don't just self-execute. You do need to have mobilization around it, but it gives movements and activists a tool, and I think it's essential.
Jackie disagrees, so it's only fair for me to give you, Dr. Hakim, the opportunity to choose.
Actually, we don't disagree, actually. But there is a major debate in Brazil, there has been a major debate in Brazil. During the autocratic rule, the assumption was that the cake had to grow before being split up among the population. Yes, it is the major issue. What has happened over the past 12 years with the Workers' Party in government is that they have begun to distribute wealth on a speed that the country is not generating as much wealth to respond to that. And so the answer that the federal government found was to increase national debt, public debt, in order to respond to this new demand, which has been, it has been trying to respond to.
Dr. Khardim, you have a point made earlier today in the session about the role of electoral politics and how it can mess up any progressive socio-economic agenda. How has Brazil come around to manage the influence of elections and campaigning in order to free the space for socio-economic agenda to really take off and be as progressive as Brazilians want? Or have you not?
No, as I would have indicated in a longer presentation, I'm sorry if I insist on that, I repeat myself, but socio-economic rights have always been an electoral tool. We have not escaped that. I don't know. That's why I said that socio-economic rights, cultural rights in Brazil do not have an ethical anchor or egalitarian philosophy as an anchor to promote them. The purpose has always been, since the Vargas dictatorship in the late 30s, early 40s, a means to obtain more votes. When the military lost in 1974, they themselves expanded social rights for the workers in order to gain more votes. 2 years later, in 1976, they did pretty well in 1976 because it had expanded social rights. These rights, in the case of Brazil, unfortunately, are totally, so far have been totally tied up to the electoral purposes. There are great inequalities in society along economic and ethnic lines, no doubt about that. I agree entirely with what has been said here, that more peaceful societies, with less criminality, are those which have more equality in the distribution of wealth. That is particularly dramatic in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, where I was born, where I live. Not as frequently as I would like to, but yes, the more distribution of wealth there is, the more safety there is. That only adds to the challenge, because that has been so much accepted in the country that when it comes to the election season, the statistics of homicides and other thefts become more public, and they have to be somewhat manipulated, masqueraded for the governing party to win the election. Unfortunately, that's my reality check. But there are other issues here I'd like to address, but I think it's not a central question. You mentioned devolution. Interestingly now, constitutional exercise, there was no devolution. On the contrary, more concentration of power in the central government. Central government responds for like 70% of taxable base in the country. So all these social economic rights fall into the hands of the federal government, not the local government. And they are justiciable as well, as we mentioned here. The labor courts, a special branch of the federal judiciary, the labor courts have been very active in guaranteeing the social rights.
You're saying this about decentralization in the country. You are saying all these things about decentralization in the hands of the federal government. Yeah. In a country that led in public social accountability and participation in the Porto Alegre movement and all the rest, what happened in Brazil?
Porto Alegre movement and the social forum, as we call them, are very popular among the minorities. It never became an issue for electoral purposes over the country. Actually, it's not. I don't think it's taking place anymore. It took place a number of times in Brazil, but that's a thing that was never a major political issue, except for the Workers' Party, which made a big issue. But it was never a mainstream issue in the Brazilian press and the Brazilian political process. But the concentration of power is in the federal government. It's always been like this. It was a Portuguese monarchy, the Portuguese colony, and we changed it from the monarchy to the republic, but the same people stayed on, the same political elites. And the big change begins in the late 40s with the Workers' Party and labor unions. It's been changing slowly, but as I would have indicated in my presentation, labor unions in Brazil were treated and still are an instrument of manipulation of the federal government. They are not labor unions like you may see in other parts of the world. Labor unions which contest government, challenge government. They are part of the government secret, not so secret negotiations. Very seldom you will find a labor leader who actually leads an opposition party or an opposition policy. It's always an alternative means of electoral politics to manipulate labor unions. They're not independent. Nothing like the German labor unions or the French labor unions, AFL-CIO, etc. Nothing like that.
I think what you are telling us is to be very careful that while the rights, economic and social rights, guarded by constitutions and claimed by people, is something we need to be concerned about. You're also telling us to be aware of an electoral cycle that can affect the march towards equality, that the electoral cycle sometimes harms this march. And we shouldn't get disheartened when it happens. We should continue to push for advancement in some, when elections sometimes take us back or keep good people with good ideas out of the race. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is the experience of other countries on this issue. But unfortunately, like the old Frank Sinatra song, my story's too sad to be told. But that's the story. They were in social rights in Brazil. On it, they expand, they retract, depending on the government that is in power, or depending on the mobilization capacity of the workers to demand to make their own demands.
Last thoughts, because I should actually be closing the session according to the organizers. I would like Dr. Okot and the others in turn to give us some of your experiences, either based on what's in the Constitution or in the constitutional process, of key stakeholders who have pushed for more rights to housing, education, and health. And I thank you for also reminding us of the regional diversity, which is very key in the Arab world. Some regions are worse than others, and that should be taken into consideration. So thanks for this reminder. Your constitution of 2010 established certain mechanisms that we think are important for pushing and claiming the rights of people. Judicial Service Commission, National Human Rights and Equality Commission. You have Freedom of Information Act in the new Constitution. You have protection for human property, something that goes against some of the international discourse on formalization of right. Tell us from your experience, what are the instruments your society in Kenya has in its hands because of the new Constitution to push progressively forward the fulfillment of social rights?
Okay, I think first before I answer that question, can I just make a quick comment about this issue of elections? I think the first thing that, I just said in a nutshell, maybe during discussion I can expand more, is that I think what we said in Kenya, we knew that always the electoral cycle will take advantage of people's vulnerability and poverty. Because what you saw in the clip I showed you, that is poverty, fighting poverty. You didn't see middle class guys with machetes killing each other. Those are poor folks in the slum areas, and normally this is the group that the politicians target. So I think what we did is we actually regulated, if we read our constitutional draft, we actually regulated the entire electoral cycle, including appointing members of minority minors groups into positions of representation, National Assembly and the Senate, so they can have a voice in the policy decisions in the country. But what mechanisms do we put in place? I think the first thing that you read our constitution generally is we have established a whole raft of checks and balances in the constitution. That the executive is now checked by the parliament, parliament checked by the judiciary, and we also created bodies like some of the commissions. We have a whole chapter on commissions, I think chapter 15 of the Kenyan Constitution, or on national commission. And we will require, for example, the National Commission on Human Rights and Equity, Equality, to make a representation of the progress on implementation of human rights generally. So they will be annually before Parliament to say this is where we are in implementing eco-social rights. And like I said before, it's no longer enough for the executive to say they are not able to. They are now called upon to demonstrate. So even the president of the Republic of Kenya is required annually to give the national address towards the implementation of the Constitution. And he must file a report annually. And of course there is a chapter, in the last chapter in our Constitution, which is how do you enforce or construe the Constitution? it gives a latitude for anyone to say, we think in the area of ECOSOC rights, there is no implementation of this constitution according to its national values and principles. I mean, we have specific articles. I mean, like, maybe tomorrow I'll be able to demonstrate to you the product of our process, the product of our approach in terms of actual drafting articles in the Constitution. So that I would say are some of the mechanisms that are in place. But another mechanism I would say is we have actually come up with an equitable sharing formula in the Constitution. I think it must be Article 2 or 3 of our Kenyan Constitution. That what is the national cake? So we ask that question. What is the national cake? What do we collect as Kenya? What do we call national wealth? Then we say, okay, now that this is the national cake, we must then redistribute this wealth equitably. So we say at least 15% of what is collected nationally must go to all the counties. Then we say, because we don't trust the executive, because the biggest elephant in the room always when you're running the economy is the executive. So we say, we don't trust the executive to distribute this wealth. So we have created in our constitution the Commission for Revenue Allocation. Independent of the executive, independent of the treasury, independent of the poor collect. So we say, you will be in charge of distributing this national cake. And because our governments are sometimes lavish, you know, probably the Kenyan politician is the highly paid in the world, probably around about $15,000 US. So we've created a commission called Salaries and Remuneration Commission. Because sometimes government is known for waste, grand corruption. So we say now the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, you will be in charge of saying what is reasonable in terms of national expenditure, in terms of salaries and everything. So I'm not sure to say those are some of the commission, but with the time, of course, I'll be able to explain more rather than mention this. Yes.
Thank you very much for that. You're giving us, I'm sure, some good questions to ask you. Talking about questions, we will be ending this session soon. So if you have any questions to our guests, please write them down, give them to me. I will give your questions to the guests. And Marwan has promised that he will find room in the schedule of the day for the guests to come back with answers to your questions. So please give me the questions and we'll make sure our guests will answer them in the course of the afternoon. Finally, I would like to turn to this side of the panel. Carlo, you've been listening to the discussion so far. Ecuador's constitution has produced some pioneering work, especially on the environment and the right of nature, as well as youth and women. Tell us a bit more about these achievements in that constitution and how is societal groups, social movements, political parties, unions taking those forward and pushing on the agenda of social justice.
Thank you. I think one of the most, the Ecuadorian Constitution has several very innovative concepts. One of them is the good living. All the economic, social, cultural rights and the human rights, they don't have these categories. They're all, they all have the same importance and they all can be demanded or judged. I mean, they all could be implemented and should be implemented by the state. So this new category of the good living, in the beginning, when I was working at the Constitution Assembly, I was kind of afraid because it was I thought it was something very demagogic. You know, there's a lot of demagogy, could have a lot of demagogic consequences. But all of these changes, and for example, the nature's rights, right? The nature has rights in Ecuador, and that is, for instance, right now, so far, it's more a political concept than a legal one. Since its implementation has been a little bit difficult, you know, but more and more the legislation is evolving, and one of the main conditions that I've seen so far that would avoid all these new provisions to stay in nothing is how they are implemented through public policies. and again, I will come back to the idea of the political will. Since there is a very strong political capital from the president and right now the government, and also controls the National Assembly, the Congress, there's a political will in order to implement all these public policies through laws and through the actions of the ministries. So even though, and that's one of the things that I was listening to when I was listening to Dr. talking about how much does it cost. I mean, it is great. We all are have the constitutional right to have a good living. But what that means to every one of us, or every single person, could be different from the other. So that raised some questions about what do you mean by good living? What is good living for me, or for my neighbor, or for an indigenous community? And how much will this cost? So in the long run, there is the fact of the political will, but also there is a much needed responsibility, especially fiscally, in order to implement those things. We benefit from natural resources, and that has managed and has been a very important source of income for the country in order to implement these policies and reduce inequality and to guarantee more safety. But in the long run, one of the other things that is also showing some sort of seriousness about how they are taking this into consideration, how they are implementing all these social and economic rights, is the fact that also the country has been very fiscally responsible. And the Constitution also establishes some very strict measures of fiscal responsibility, which are, I think, in a good balance in order to design very effective and efficient public policies that will allow these rights to become real. And also there's this very constraint right now. People respect a lot this about the planning. Even though planning has been seen sometimes as a very restricting tool in order for development of the country, in this case it has allowed the country to use the monies more efficiently. And that's one of the things that the Constitution emphasizes, on the fact of the need of the planning. And if you want to spend money or you want to receive money from the state, you need to tell what are you going to do with this money, and if this money will be used towards the objectives of the Constitution or the national plan. So I think that's one of the things that is very important. It's the fact that if you don't have a political will who will make these public policies, then you won't get any of the constitutional rights implemented. But also, this is the third factor that I think is very important, and that's one of the reasons that maybe this government, the actual government, has a lot of political capital, is the fact that he has managed to balance also that with some fiscal responsibility. And maybe that's a formula that so far has worked for Ecuador. There have been some very important improvements in social indicators, in economic indicators, and has given us political stability. As you mentioned in the beginning of the session, in Ecuador, in a period of 10 years, we had 7 presidents. So it was almost a president a year. And now we have seen that there's political stability. The institutions have some sort of stability right now. But it's also a matter of leadership, as we mentioned also before, that concept of leadership, because that will allow to set an example for the rest of the political parties, the rest of political actors, on how you should provide and give the importance to institutions and to rules. So you can really show that those results that you're presenting are real and are becoming realities through public policies.
Thank you, Pablo. Jackie, how allow South Africans shape forward through social movements and associations, professional partners, for more of the rights that they deserve, given what you mentioned earlier, that your constitution has accommodated some of the power structures that were inherited from the party?
I think in South Africa you see a very strong civil society that comes up from the anti-apartheid struggle and has pretty much continued. And the way that it manifests now more and more is 2 ways. One, on the streets, a lot of protest, and There are increasing signs, I'm afraid, that the government is coming down very strongly against protesters. I hear, for example, just to take us back to Egypt, that today protests were, a rule was passed that you have to ask for permission for protests now in Egypt. It's pretty much the same in South Africa, unfortunately. It's a highly problematic way of regulating protests, in my view. And but people nonetheless go out on the streets, even if they are accused of so-called illegal or unlawful protests. They go out on the streets. And the other way is through the courts, and that's because of the socioeconomic rights in the Constitution. So people have the power, the rights, the autonomy, oh, I wanted to say something rude, but I won't. They have the strength to use the courts because it is in the Constitution. And I wanted to actually say that one of the most important things, I think, which we haven't actually touched on here, when we talk about comparative examples, is what is the consequences of the compromises? We've all talked about various compromises, and some of us have been down that track for a while, in the South African case, almost 20 years. And so we can see what the consequences are. And one of the consequences that I wanted to quickly raise about a compromise in South Africa is quite an interesting one, particularly for anybody thinking about constitution making. And that is the fact that the South African constitution process adopted a weaker form of socioeconomic rights. And where, for example, these rights were not immediately realizable. I previously criticized that, but there has been one positive consequence, and I would really urge everybody to think about this, is that unlike in Brazil, and what I know about Brazil is all due to Octavio Ferraz, and as I understand from him, the fact that there are individual rights to individual immediately realizable benefits, for example, in healthcare, where an individual can go straight to the court and get a prescription for a drug. The fact that there isn't that in South Africa has meant that there hasn't been middle-class capture of socioeconomic rights. They remain collective programmatic policy issues which poor people have captured, if you want to put it that way. So it's something worth thinking about, I think.
Jackie, you're doing one of the meanest things that a speaker can do at the end of the session, which is say something of high interest that requires another session. But maybe that is something I ask the organizers to continue to ask Jackie to give some input on, because you said the word capture by the middle class, which is something inherent in many Arab political economies, that to advance the social justice agenda, you need to convince the middle class to give up its position as a free rider, crowding out the poor and taking state resources for itself. So this is an issue that we might want to continue to ask questions about in the rest of the session. I close the session here. I apologize to our experts who are here with a lot of information, rich experience, and we have only given them a few minutes to share their experience. I urge you to write your questions, and we will give it to them, and they will engage with you on answers to your questions. Difficult to summarize, but I'll leave with you some messages for further discussion, no conclusions. Message number one: constitutions and the rights in them do not self-execute. They require a lot of societal pressure. Message number two: constitutions might accommodate some economic power structures, but they also provide tools and mechanisms that empower the people, and Okuru from Kenya has given us some of these mechanisms of empowerment that the Kenyan 2010 Constitution has pioneered to institute. Message number three: beware of election cycles because financing social and economic rights are always an issue during election cycles. But last message is there are very important tools to check on leadership's accountability to the people, and some of them were mentioned today in the session, such as the devolution clauses, or the decentralization, that's the word we use in the Arab world, the equalization clauses which shift national wealth to the most needy regions, but with a limited period of time, commissions that monitor states' progressive realization of those rights, and many, many other ideas that I'm sure you have captured. I thank you all very much, and we look forward to a continued engagement with us today and tomorrow. And it's lunch, Marwan. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you very much. لو سمحت الغداء مباشرة عند الاسم، وسنبدأ الجلسة بعدين الساعة 3 مباشرة. شكرا. طبعا حسين